One day, when I was a student at Miami of Ohio University, I decided to fast. I was in a transitional stage of my life trying to make some important decisions regarding my future. And I had heard that fasting was a way to seek God's will, and I remember when I was growing up being asked at church to fast before the election of our elders and deacons. Of course, I had never done that before, but I felt the need to try this act of righteousness. I decided to go from 11 o'clock one evening until 11 o'clock the next night. And the only thing I would allow myself would be water. Well, the first 8 hours were easy. Of course, I was asleep then. And it wasn't bad the next morning either, because I seldom at that time ever ate breakfast, so I wasn't like I missed anything. My last class was over at 11 o'clock that morning, and for the first time, what I was doing began to hit me. You see, normally I would go to the cafeteria for lunch at 11 o'clock. That way I beat the crowd at noon. And since I went so early, I usually ate alone, so it wasn't like anybody would miss me. But I was experiencing hunger pains, and for the first time I wondered if I was doing the right thing. I remember hearing something about using the time usually spent eating and prayer. So I took a walk around campus, praying and trying to keep my mind off of food. I was a little uncomfortable, but I told myself that I only had 12 hours to go. Well, that afternoon I went over to a friend's room down the hall in my dorm to hang out like we always did, and I realized how much I actually snacked during the day. My friend had a bowl of M&Ms and a bag of chips on his desk, and the temptation was great to eat. In fact, I caught myself with a handful of M&Ms in my hand, ready to pop them in my mouth without even thinking about it. I threw them back in the bowl and went to my room, closed the door, and tried to read my Bible. By mid-afternoon, all I could think about was food. I knew I had to hide somewhere at supper time, because a bunch of us in the dorm would always go eat together. And if I was in my room, they'd come knocking to ask me to go with them. So I took off on another walk, this one on the main road out of town. When I got back a couple hours later, several of the guys wondered why I hadn't gone to supper with them. I mumbled something about doing something else. Well, the last 5 hours of my fast were horrible. I had given up any pretext of praying and reading scripture, and tried to take my mind off food by watching some TV. Do you know how many food commercials on television? Well, finally, about 10 o'clock that evening, I ordered a sandwich, fries, and drinks from a local food joint, justifying my action by saying they stopped delivery at 11 o'clock, so I had to order it then if I wanted to eat before morning. And anyway, it would take about an hour before the food got to my room. Well, the food arrived at 10:45, and I did manage to hold on for the last 15 minutes of my fast. I quickly said a prayer at 11 o'clock, gobbled the food, and went to bed. You see, like many of you, fasting is not a discipline that I have really tried to develop. That fast was some 45 years ago. And since then, I have tried it again 2 or 3 times, but I find that my mind focuses more on food than God. I wonder sometimes if the act is worth the effort. This past Wednesday was Ash Wednesday, marking the beginning of Lent. Now, in our church, we do not observe this tradition, but part of the practice of Ash Wednesday and Lent is fasting. And that fits perfectly into what we're looking at this morning from Matthew chapter 5, verses 16 through 18. We've been looking the last couple of weeks about what Jesus calls our acts of righteousness from the Sermon on the Mount. In the Jewish culture of his day, there were 3 acts of righteousness that all the Jews needed to perform to be considered holy: giving, praying, and fasting. Now, giving and praying are easy for us to understand, and maybe even easy for us to do, at least to some extent. But fasting is not something we talk about or do very often, if at all. I suppose fasting has lost some of its appeal today, partly because we have so much food in our culture. For years, politicians have campaigned on the theme, a chicken in every pot. And in our land of plenty, overeating has become a sign of prosperity, not a sin. However, we cannot escape the fact that Jesus calls fasting an act of righteousness, just like giving and just like praying. All three acts of righteousness have in common the idea of self-denial. When we fast, we give up food. Now, whether we spend the time we normally eat in prayer or concentrating on spiritual matters, or some do use the money saved not buying food as a gift for a cause or need, none of that really matters. See, fasting is a time to clear out our minds and our bodies and look to Jesus. However, as Jesus suggests in our text, if we can't do it with the right attitude, it is better not to do it at all. Now, some commentaries skim over fasting by calling it purely optional. However, the act is mentioned 64 times in the Bible. And in our text today, Jesus assumes that fasting will be part of our lifestyle. Notice that he does not say, if you want to fast, or if you decide to fast. Rather, he says, when you fast. Again, remember, these acts of righteousness do not save us. We are saved by grace through faith in baptism to then do those good works. And fasting, like prayer and giving, is one of the good works we are to be doing. The difference here is that we do good works not because we have to, but because we want to, as a way of honoring and glorifying God. Let's look at our text, Matthew chapter 6, beginning at verse 16. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to men that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now, don't let the fact that Jesus spends the least amount of time talking about this act of righteousness fool you. It's not less important than giving or praying, but the hypocrite and his reward and our attitude, you see, have already been discussed. So there's not much more new or different for Jesus to say here. The idea of doing it wrong is the idea of being a hypocrite. The hypocrite or play actor will make a big deal about fasting. He will, by how he looks, make it obvious that he's sacrificing food. Someone who goes on a hunger strike makes a big deal about not eating in the hope they will get what they want. If you stop eating long enough, you will noticeably lose weight, which sometimes becomes a primary motivation to go without food. But as Jesus says, they have received their reward in full. They received the attention they wanted. They received the weight loss they wanted, but not what they were going for, and that was to seek God. If that's true, then what reward for proper fasting are we missing out on? As we consider whether we should fast today, let's begin by looking at an account of fasting. An account of fasting. A definition may be in order here. To fast means to deny yourself food or water for a period of time. This can be all food or just certain foods, all drinks or just certain drinks. And it can last just a few hours or several days. I might add that if you plan to fast for more than a few hours, it might be a good idea to consult your doctor first to make sure you are healthy enough and do not have any kind of medical condition that might be worsened by fasting. An extended time of fasting should always include some kind of drinking, because your body will dehydrate, and a person can only go so many days before their body is seriously affected from the lack of food. Hurting yourself by fasting does not glorify God or in any way honor Him. Actually, there's only one time in the Bible that God commanded the people to fast, and that was on the Day of Atonement, a special day set aside by the Jews to seek God's forgiveness for their sins. Leviticus chapter 23 details what happens on that day. Look at what it says. The 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Hold a sacred assembly and deny yourselves and present an offering to the Lord God. You see, this was a public and corporate fast. All Israel was to take part. The day was to be spent in worship and the offering of a sacrifice. The emphasis here is that nothing was to be done, including eating, except worshiping God. It was to show humiliation and submission to God. This is the only time the fast was commanded. But throughout the Bible, we see other voluntary fasts. Centuries later, after Israel was taken into captivity, the priests began to have regular times of fasting. This fasting became a sign of mourning for their sins. They would wear sackcloth and sprinkle dust on their heads to show their sorrow, and spent their time asking for God's forgiveness. Although this fast was probably begun as a sincere attempt to seek God's mercy, it deteriorated into religious showing off. Zechariah chapter 7 has God asking a very penetrating question about this fast. He says, "Ask all the people of the land and the priests, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th months for the past 70 years, was it really for me that you fasted?" In Nehemiah chapter 9, after the Israelites returned to Jerusalem, they found scrolls containing their scripture, and in preparation for its reading, the people fasted. In Psalm 35, David talked about fasting, along with wearing sackcloth, as the way he humbled himself before God. The prophet Daniel often fasted whenever he heard about God's wrath. And after Jonah finally preached to the people of Nineveh, they all fasted as a sign of sorrow and repentance. In Acts chapter 9, Paul, after being blinded on the road to Damascus, fasted for 3 days. Later in Acts chapter 13, the church fasted before sending Paul and Barnabas off on their missionary journey. By Jesus' day, fasting seems to be the natural thing to do before undertaking some kind of important task. When Jesus was tempted in Matthew chapter 4, it came after he had fasted for 40 days. It's believed the Pharisees fasted twice a week, on Mondays and Thursdays, to show their righteousness. One cannot look through Scripture at the references to fasting and think that the act is not for us. The only question is how will we respond to this act of righteousness? Think about this. Are there some hidden blessings through fasting that we're missing out on? So, as we consider whether we should be fasting today, let's next consider the action of fasting. The action. Fasting is an act of righteousness, and all acts of righteousness demonstrate sacrifice, self-discipline, and self-denial. In Bible days, most people literally lived from hand to mouth. You would be consumed with finding food, enough food just to eat just for that day. So to voluntarily pass on a meal was considered to be almost crazy. Just the opposite occurs today. We have so much food in America that we never have to go without. The reason I had such trouble with my first fast was because I had never in my life gone more than a few hours without food. So for most of us, unless you skip a meal because of a diet or because you're busy, it seems almost foolish to go hungry today. Jesus never tells us how long we should fast. It was assumed by the Jews of his day that you would fast on a regular basis. The normal fast at Bible times was a day long. However, there were times when you might fast a little bit longer. For instance, as I mentioned, Jesus fasted for 40 days, which is not recommended unless you are in very good physical shape and conditioned to fasting. It was more common to fast for a couple hours or a day. Yet it also acceptable for that and it was acceptable to fast for just a few hours, maybe just skipping one meal. A case can even be made that denying yourself just certain foods, either permanently or for a period of time, like the Lenten season does, can be considered fasting. Actually, did you know that we all fast every day? From the time we go to bed until we wake up, we are not eating, assuming you don't get up for a midnight snack. Therefore, we are fasting. That's why the first meal of the day is called breakfast or break fast. Interestingly, later on in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus is questioned as to why his disciples were not fasting. We'll look at that story in a few weeks, but the point seems to be there was no need to fast because they were with Jesus. So it appears as if fasting is only necessary in certain seasons of our lives, when we're struggling with something or before we begin something new and important. The emphasis in Jesus' teaching about fasting in Matthew chapter 6 seems to be on our appearance when we fast. He tells us to oil our heads and wash our face. In other words, take a shower and put on your deodorant. As far as anyone is concerned, nothing should look different in your life. Then only God will know what you're doing. So when do we fast? As I already mentioned, there was only one time in the Bible that God commanded a fast, and that was on the Day of Atonement. Well, we know we are no longer bound by that need because Jesus atoned for our sins when he died on the cross. That means anytime we fast today, it is purely voluntary. What then would prompt us to fast? Well, maybe when we're facing a major crisis, when we need direction and help in our lives, and when we are facing a major life change. Those are all biblical examples of good times to fast. The question, though, is still, do we have to? No, we don't have to. But when done with the right attitude, it can really help clarify things for us. Let me refer back to my example of fasting that I started this message with. As I said, I was in a crisis time in my young life. You see, since I was a little boy, I wanted to be a writer. But when I got to college, I discovered I was woefully inadequate in my understanding of verbs, nouns, and sentence structure. A professor told me that I couldn't write, and I was flunking out of all my classes. In a word, I was miserable. The purpose of my fast was to seek God's will for my life. In spite of my less than noble ability to go just 24 hours without food, God still blessed my effort. The very next day, after my fast, everything became so very clear to me. You see, for years, people had told me that I should go to Bible college, but I stubbornly refused. I wanted to be a writer, not a preacher. Even at Miami, I had preached a couple of times at the campus house, worship services, and the kids all told me I was good at that, but it never dawned on me that maybe I should consider that as a career. Several of my friends and many kids I knew from church camp, had gone to Bible college, and they kept inviting me to go with them to Bible college, but I still did not get it. Maybe I'm stubborn and bullheaded, because even though God had been telling me for years what to do to my friends and my family, I was not listening. But when I stopped thinking about myself and looked to God, humbly submitting to Him by denying myself food, it was like a light turned off. I knew what I needed to do, and it was like a burden had been lifted. So I transferred to Bible college, and my grades improved, my attitude became more positive, and as everything suddenly fell into place, I knew I was doing the right thing. You know, as I've said, that was 45 years ago. And I've only shared that story a couple of times before. And I do it now not to brag or make myself look good, but as an example of what fasting is all about. To be honest, the few times I have fasted since then, the answers have not come as quickly or clearly, but I've always felt a closeness to God when fasting. That's very special. And that leads to the final thing we should consider when we think about fasting, and that is our attitude toward fasting. Our attitude toward fasting. Why we do something is sometimes as significant as what we do. Fasting shows humility, sorrow, and dependence upon God. Do we have to fast in order to have that attitude? No, we don't, but it can help direct our focus to the things of God. And you know, fasting is the most private of the three acts of righteousness Jesus describes. In our giving, we were told not to let our left hand know what our right hand is doing, but monetary gifts to the church will still be noticed. If people see what you give and honor you for that, that may be your only reward, but the money can still be used for the kingdom. Prayer should be done in our room with our door closed, but people will see us go into our room. If you pray just to be noticed, that may be hypocritical, but your words can still bless someone and help them in their time of need. But if people see you fasting, what difference does that make? They might think you're holy, but it doesn't change their lives. How will anyone ever know if we are fasting, since Jesus specifically says not to let people know? Fasting is secret. And fasting in secret really shows what we are like when no one is looking. Most of what we do as Christians, we do as a group. The New Testament is full of injunctions to love one another, to care for each other, to not forsake the assembling together. It's all about the group. Most of the teaching is about relationships and working with others, getting along with other people. Church is only church, you see, when two or more are gathered together. Fasting is about the only thing we do by ourselves. You see, it's easy to fake righteousness in a crowd. We know how to sing the right songs, to say the right catchphrases, to dress appropriately, but it's impossible to fake righteousness in front of God, who knows and sees everything about us. We can fool some of the people all the time, and all the people some of the time, but we can never fool God. The principle of fasting, as described by Jesus in our text, is actually the principle our whole Christian lifestyle should be based on. God knows we do, and we do too. We know too that when we're honest with ourselves, that we are not holy or good. The whole point of the Sermon on the Mount, you see, is not to make us better, but to lead us to the only one who is better, Jesus Christ. Fasting is one way to help us be humble and submissive to God. But before we can do this act of righteousness, we need to know who Jesus is. We need to understand what He did for us. Otherwise, it just becomes a work. It just becomes something we do as a holiness thing.